everybody. Just by way of a little introduction, I thought I'd tell you a little bit about us. My name's Katie. I'm the chair of the Hastings and Rye Palestine Solidarity Campaign, and we're a small but quite active local group campaigning for equality, freedom and justice for Palestinians. Can you all hear me all right?
Yes.
Brilliant. Okay. So just to say, we put on lots of different type of events. We hold regular stalls in Hastings and in Rye, and we put on an event called Come Down for Palestine recently, which was just a lot of lovely food and Palestinian music. We also had a Palestinian film festival, and we've hosted a range of terrifically diverse range of speakers. We had Layla Hassan, who came and spoke from Women in Hebron, which is a women's embroidery collective, and she spoke very movingly about daily life under occupation in Hebron. We had Dr. Kader Abu Haye, who spoke about his family's disastrous life as refugees after they were forced at gunpoint from their homes in 1948 as part of the Nakba, the catastrophe. And we also had the author and analyst, Ben White, who came and talked to us about shifting political situations, as well as gave readings from his most recent book, Cracks in the Wall, Beyond Apartheid in Palestine, Israel. We welcome all these different voices and perspectives in the interest of furthering our understanding and our knowledge. And today we're particularly pleased to welcome Miko Peled, who brings his unique voice to this area. Miko was born and brought up in Jerusalem. He was the son of a prominent Zionist family. His grandfather was a signatory to Israel's Declaration of Independence, and his father was a general among Israel's military top brass. But in '97, a family tragedy sent Miko on a journey of discovery, a journey into Palestine, and one, he says, which involved dismantling a lifetime of racist assumptions. His book, The General's Son, Journey of an Israeli in Palestine, describes this transformation to Palestinian human rights advocate, and we are delighted to welcome him here in Hastings, his first visit to the town. So Miko's going to talk, and then we'll take questions from the floor. So please do save your questions to the end. I'm sure he'll be thrilled to answer them. After that, we'll have refreshments, and unfortunately, no books. They didn't turn up, but Miko says he's willing to sign anything else you've got. So thank you. Please welcome our guest speaker, Miko Peled.
Well, thank you, Katie, for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me, and thank you all for being here. It's lovely to see this room full, completely full, standing room only. So this is the third of 3 lectures that I've given, that I've had here in the UK over the last 3 days. I was in London 2 days ago, Eastbourne yesterday, and here today. And they've all been full, and the conversation has been engaging, and people have been terrific. Can you hear me in the back? Okay. No? No. All right, I'll speak louder. This is better, yeah? All right. So, can I see a show of hands? Is anybody here from Palestine, Israel, however we choose to call it? 1 or 2 people?
Well, I'm the son of 1948.
Okay. Anybody been there to visit? Okay, quite a few people. All right, good. Good. Well, so like you heard, the story that I tell comes from maybe a rather strange or unique place, because I come from this very, very Zionist, very, very patriotic background. Probably as Zionist and patriotic Israeli as you could possibly be. Because so many members of my close family have been heavily involved in the creation of the State of Israel and the creation of the Israeli military, and in the building and perpetuating the myth, which is the Zionist myth and the myth of the greatness of the Israeli military. The Zionist myth is one that has been completely accepted, swallowed, and cherished by the West in general. because it's so romantic, because it's so historic, and it's got so much religion and biblical themes. So these Jewish people who were exiled, forcibly exiled from their homeland 2,000 years ago, then suffered persecution for 2,000 years, then had undergone the Holocaust, and now they're back, and they've revived, and they've built a state for themselves in their ancient homeland. I mean, what could be more powerful, more romantic, and how could you possibly stand there and say that there's something wrong about that? How could you possibly stand there and criticize that? And to top it all off, this wonderful state that they had built, that they had established, is called Israel. How could anybody speak out against Israel? How could anybody say anything negative about Israel? Again, it's so biblical, it's so historic, it's so romantic. It brings back all these memories of King David and Solomon and his wisdom, and on and on and on and on. So that's where I come from. Now, growing up with a father who's a general in a society that is completely militaristic, in a society that placed the army and all of the security forces really above anything in terms of value, is an enormous thing. Particularly the generation to which my father belonged, which were young officers in 1948, which of course we call the War of Independence, when we kicked out the British and we defeated the Arab armies, and we, stated our claim, and we won, and we finally were able to establish our state. And then later on, these young officers that did that in 1948 were generals in 1967. And again, these were two military campaigns that not only struck a chord and are very powerful in terms of the history and what they did and how they operated, and how the ingenuity of the officers and so forth, and standing the David against Goliath, all these Arab armies coming to attack, and on and on. But this is also something that struck a chord in the West, all over the world, but particularly in the West. The battles of Ariel Sharon being studied in military academies around the world, and on and on and on. That's that generation. And that generation, probably more than any other generation of generals, is held in the highest esteem. They're called the generation of 1948. And again, like you heard, I have a grandfather who signed the Declaration of Independence, and a great uncle who was a president. Never mind, the president of Israel is an insignificant role, but it sounds grand. And again, this is not to boast or anything like that, but this is really the background. So for me, Zionism was something that I drank and ate and consumed and breathed every single day of my life. And these were the people around the dinner table. These were the people at family gatherings, at weddings, and so forth. And as you grow up as a child, this is very, very powerful. So what changes? How do you change from that to suddenly going around the world and speaking about Palestinian rights and rejecting Zionism? Well, to my experience, there's only one kind of experience that pushes us from the things we believe in, forces us to examine the things that we were taught, the truths that we were taught, and then kind of ejects us from that and into something else. And that's sadly usually a tragedy. Usually it's only a terrible tragedy, something that really shocks us to the core, that makes us transform like that. And in my case, like you heard, it was, or maybe you haven't heard, but in 1997, my sister's little girl was killed in a suicide attack in Jerusalem. And that is precisely the kind of shock that will force you, I suppose if you're honest enough, it will force you to re-examine everything you believe in. Because how could you possibly understand? I don't think we're even meant to be able to understand. How is it that three young men can take their own lives, killing a whole bunch of, young innocent civilians with them, who they don't even know? How do you begin to understand something like this? It's impossible to understand it. And again, I don't think we're capable of understanding it, or I don't think we should be able to understand it. But there it is, and suddenly you're faced with this reality. And to me, that was the drive to start investigating and try to figuring out what is going on here. And that propelled me into this journey. And the title of my first book, The General Son, the subtitle is Journey of an Israeli in Palestine. And that subtitle is really, it really forces us to examine what's Israeli, where is Palestine, where is Israel? Is there a place where Israel ends and Palestine begins? Is it the same place? We have to start examining that just by looking at that subtitle. And that's exactly what the journey was. The journey for me was to examine what is Palestine and what is Israel, and how come there are Palestinians who are Israeli citizens, and how come there are millions of Palestinians around the world living in refugee camps, and on and on and on. And what is my role in all this? Really, to sum it up, the journey is geographically, of course, insignificant because it's a very, very small country. But the journey is a political journey, an emotional journey, a mental journey, which is incredibly difficult. And to this day, there are actually very few Israelis who have taken this journey. Very few. Now, I was born and raised in Jerusalem, and when I was growing up, there were no checkpoints. There was no such thing as a checkpoint. There certainly was not a wall. Physically. There were no checkpoints, and there was no wall physically. But there was no need for a wall or checkpoints, because none of us, no Israeli that I knew, would even think of going into a Palestinian neighborhood. Would even think of going into a Palestinian city. Now, there are Palestinian cities within what they call the pre-1967 Israel. These are Palestinian cities where Palestinians live who are Israeli citizens. Nazareth, for example. And there are many others. But none of us would dream to go there, certainly not alone. And growing up in Jerusalem, after 1967, Jerusalem was quote-unquote united. But none of us would have dreamt of going into a Palestinian neighborhood in Jerusalem. And the reason we wouldn't have dreamt of doing so is because Arabs are dangerous. And they're unpredictable. And they're prone to violence. And they're kind of lazy, and they're not so clean, and you can't really trust them. So, as an Israeli, and of course they hate Jews. So why would we possibly venture into such an environment? Today there actually are checkpoints and there is a wall. And there are these big signs that warn you, and if you've been to Palestine, there are big signs that warn you, particularly if you're an Israeli, that you're about to enter Palestinian-controlled areas, that it's a risk, and that you are about to commit a felony. In other words, crossing, you're risking your own life, you're taking your life in your own hands, and you're committing a felony at the same time. So, once again, why would anybody want to do that? But basically, the journey is a journey of the occupier, the colonizer, the white privileged man, into the sphere, if you will, the neighborhood, the city, of the occupied, the colonized, the oppressed. And typically that is not a journey that is taken very often, because why would I want to leave my neighborhood, my sphere, where there's always electricity and the roads are paved and it looks like this, it's all very nice. I wouldn't dream of not having water in the tap. I wouldn't dream of not watering the lawn. I wouldn't dream of not having the roads paved. Why would I venture from that into this other area where the roads are full of potholes and people look poor and they speak a different language, and I'm told my entire life that they want to kill us? But that's the journey. And it doesn't matter if we're in Palestine, in America, in Australia, in South Africa, it's the same journey, it's the same issue. The Zionists really invented nothing new. Well, they did invent one thing new, and that's they're using the name Israel, which from a publicity perspective was brilliant, because it's much harder to attack. It's much harder to criticize. But in terms of what was put in place in Palestine, they did nothing new. In terms of the settler colonialism and the racism, they did nothing new. The violence and so forth against the other. And the racist characteristics and the racist education system that I was a part of that prepares me for the reality in which the segregation is going to be complete. Now, if you've been there, you know it's a very small country. To maintain such effective segregation in such a small country, you really, really have to make a serious effort. You have to be very, very good at it. And Israel is very good at it. Like I said, growing up in Jerusalem, or actually growing up in any part of the country, you're never more than a 10-minute drive from a Palestinian neighborhood, from a Palestinian city. Yet the segregation is complete. There are no activities for youth, there are no sporting activities, there are no cultural activities. There's nothing to bring the two sides together, quite the opposite. One side continues to be oppressed, one side continues to be privileged and be taught that they want to kill us. That we have a right, they do not, and therefore we have to continue doing what we've been doing. That's been the journey. Traveling from this one sphere to this other sphere, and sometimes it's just a matter of crossing the streets. Literally, or driving for 10 minutes. And I remember vividly the first time I drove into Nazareth by myself. It's full of Arabs. The billboards were in Arabic. And I was lost. What do I do? If I ask for directions, they're going to know I'm lost, and that's it. I'm doomed. And the thing that we always say is, yeah, people you see in the street might look nice, but all it takes is one, right? We hear this about blacks, we hear this about Arabs, we hear this about anybody who is not European. All it takes is one. As we drop napalm on everybody else around the world. So it was, that was the experience. And the first time I drove into the West Bank by myself, same thing. But having taken the journey, of course, every time you take the journey again and again and again, you feel better about it, because you realize once you cross the checkpoint, once you cross the street, once you end up in that neighborhood, the truth is, nobody really cares that you're there. It's not just that it's not dangerous. Nobody cares. Nobody stops from, the way Israel, and I still have this conversation with friends and family who look at me in awe that I would go to Ramallah or I would go to a Palestinian town, and they say, well, yeah, they know you, so they're not going to hurt you, but if I went there, they'd kill me. And I think, you think they give a damn if you show up or I show up? You think the street stops, all the cars stop, all the kids going to school stop, all the businesses close down because you decided to come and visit? Nobody cares. The cars keep driving, the traffic jams continue to be traffic jams, the kids keep going to school, and nobody could care less that you're there, whether Israeli or not Israeli. It's just these crazy little demons that run around our mind. And I think a sense of entitlement, that I'm so important that if I showed up, there would be somebody there ready to kill me because they're waiting for me. It's a sense of kind of a self-grandizing that is really strange. And I have this conversation with people all the time. But you take the journey and you see nothing happen, and then you take it again and you take it again, and of course in the process you meet people, in the process you become familiar with the landscape, and suddenly the realization that I came to is that it's all Palestine. It's all Palestine. And the terminology that is used, there's Israel, and then there are the occupied Palestinian territories. I'm sure you've heard that. OPT. There's Israel, and then there's the OPT. And then you have Israelis, and then you have settlers. The Israelis are the ones that live on one side, the settlers live on the other side. So my question is this: if there is such a thing as occupied Palestinian territories, Does that mean that there's some place out there where there are Palestinian territories that are not occupied? And if so, where are they? And if you have Israelis on one side and settlers on the other, does that mean that Israelis are actually not settlers? In other words, if you live in Tel Aviv, in Haifa, in Jerusalem, West Jerusalem, like where I grew up, that we're not settlers? Only those people living in what used to be the West Bank are settlers? And if so, why? What's the difference? And that's when the realization comes. You walk around or you drive around what used to be called the West Bank. And by the way, there is no such thing anymore as the West Bank. Actually, there never were. There never was. The West Bank is a piece of Palestine that some Israelis sat down and drew with a line and decided that that was going to be a separate entity. And then when they were tired of that entity being separate, they took it and made it part of Israel. And it no longer exists. What used to be the West Bank is actually called Judea and Samaria. And Judea and Samaria is an integral part of the state of Israel, just like any other part of the state of Israel. They have their own police force, their own bureaucracy, their own schools, their own shopping malls, big beautiful cities, big towns and farms and everything else. What makes the Judea and Samaria unique is, we are told, that within Judea and Samaria we have pockets of problematic population. A non-Jewish problematic population. And, well, what are you going to do? They're there. We have to deal with them. That's why we have a strong security force, we've got a secret police, we've got an army, and they deal with it. Otherwise, it's a wonderful place to live. That's it. And the only other remnant, really, or the only remnant of that still exists from this reality where there was an Israel and a West Bank, or the pre-1967 reality, is that Palestinians who live in that part of Israel have Israeli citizenship. So Palestinians who remained in what became Israel in 1948 were given some kind of a quasi-citizenship. It is absolutely not the citizenship that I have as an Israeli, or that any other Israeli Jew has. It is not the same citizenship, but it's the same card and it's a citizenship. So the reality that this created is that some Palestinians who live in some certain parts of the country have Israeli citizenship. Palestinians who live in other parts of the country have no rights, no citizenship at all. Israelis live over the entire country. Like I said, what used to be the West Bank and is now Judea and Samaria is full of Israeli cities, full of Israeli towns, full of Israelis, towns, villages, whatever. Those Israelis have the same citizenship regardless of where they live. So, when Israel does a census, for example, they count all the Israelis, but only the Palestinians who have citizenship. So there are about 2 million Palestinians who have citizenship. There are about 5.5 million Israelis, and that's it. That's it. 2.5 or close to 2.5 million Palestinians living in a concentration camp that is called the Gaza Strip are not counted. They don't exist. This problematic population that resides in Judea and Samaria, about 3 million Palestinians, do not exist. They don't show up in any census. They don't show up in population maps. They don't show up in any maps. They don't exist. 5 million people. And Israel just had elections. You may have noticed they've been having elections every 6 months now. 5 million people who live under Israeli rule have no say. They did not vote. 5 million people who live and will be seriously affected by whatever Israeli government have no say, did not participate. Why? Well, they don't exist. They're not our problem. And these 2 million Palestinians who do have Israeli citizenship are really the only remnant that exists from that pre-1967 reality. So you have Israelis who have full citizenship and live in what you might think is a real democracy, because if you are an Israeli Jew, Israel is a democracy. Then you have Palestinians whose rights are determined by where they live. If they live in Jerusalem, then they have a certain kind of ID, a certain kind of status. If they live in Judea and Samaria, it's a different status. Of course, if they live in the Gaza Strip, it's a different status. And if they live in refugee camps outside of Palestine, that's a whole other status. And then people want to argue that Israel is not an apartheid regime. It's the most absurd argument you could possibly make. I remember I was in South Africa a few years ago, and I was actually doing an interview, and they brought this another Israeli, of course, to talk about Palestine, because we don't need Palestinians to talk Palestine. It's enough that you have 2 Jews. But it was me and another Israeli who was a Zionist, and we were discussing Palestine. And the interviewer, who was black, asked the question of the other guy, how is Israel not an apartheid regime? And it was the funniest thing I've ever seen. For about 20 seconds, he just sat there with his mouth open. He could not give an answer. And when you're on live TV and you're silent for 20 seconds, it's a very, very long time. But there is no answer to that question. Because Israel is an apartheid regime. And South Africans, of course, can see it all the way from South Africa. It was a silly question. Now, there's a great book that just came out, and I talk about it in all my lectures lately. It's called Palestine, A 4,000-Year History. It was published, I think, last year. It was written by Noor Masalha, who is a Palestinian professor that teaches over at SOAS in London. You should get the book. You should get it and read it. It's a very good read. It's a very good book. And it's the first thing I've ever read, at least in English, that talks about the history of Palestine and is completely free of the Zionist biblical narrative. It's very rare. Usually when people talk about the history of Palestine, they talk about the biblical narrative, the Zionist biblical narrative. It doesn't exist. It's pure. The book is based purely on history, which is rare when you talk about Palestine. So it's a very good exercise, especially for those of us who have been pumped with the Zionist biblical narrative their whole lives. It's kind of a cleansing, therapeutic process to read the book. But it's also fascinating. And one of the arguments he makes, and he shows, in other words, he demonstrates very clearly, that this strip of land, this country, between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, between the border with Lebanon and the Gulf of Aqaba in the south, this country has been called Palestine, or a version of Palestine, Palestine, for over 3,500 years, consistently, by historians, by rulers who ruled over the centuries, by the people who live there. It's expressed in history, it's expressed in trade, it's expressed in culture. And then one day, on the 15th of May, 1948, boom, it became Israel. And today everybody's convinced it was always Israel. It says so in the Bible. Well, it says lots of things in the Bible, but that doesn't make it history. But that's it. One day, in the middle of May of 1948, that was it. Palestine ceased to exist, and it's been Israel, and it's been the land of Israel, and that's the end of the story. Now that's severe enough. Erasing a country and placing something else in its stead is a serious matter. But the way in which this was done, the method in which this was done, is what makes it even more severe. And that method And that process, which began 71 years ago and continues, actually began more than that, and continues to this day, is what we need to take note of. Because the methods that were used and are being used by Israel are all defined by international law as crimes against humanity. The way in which Israel has transformed Palestine into something else has been defined by international law as crimes against humanity. And these are genocide, ethnic cleansing, and the establishment of an apartheid regime. Now, these are big words. These are serious accusations, and these are very serious crimes. So don't take my word for it. Check the definition of the crime of genocide. Check the definition of the crime of ethnic cleansing. And check the definition of the crime of apartheid. And compare that to what has happened in Palestine over the last 70 years. And make your own judgment, make your own decision. The similarities are striking. They're not striking, they're shocking, they're appalling. Absolutely appalling. And when you come from my background and you come to this realization, believe me, it's even more appalling. Because now you're looking at your own people who are part of your family that you used to admire, and suddenly it's a whole different story. Israel has been engaged in crimes against humanity for since it was established. Now, certainly the British have been complicit, and the Americans have been complicit, and the Germans have been complicit by supporting Israel and by allowing this to happen and enabling it to happen. But it's not something in the past. This is happening today. And all of us sitting here are allowing it to happen. We're allowing it to happen. Which is why, again, branches like this, organizations like this are so important, and events like this are so important. People have to become aware of what we're talking about. It's not two countries fighting over a piece of land. It's not two armies at war. It is a process of genocide and ethnic cleansing of the cruelest kind. It's a destruction of a people and the destruction of a country that has been ongoing for 7 decades and will not stop. Close to 2.5 million people living in a concentration camp without access to water. The water in the Gaza Strip is not fit for planting trees, for watering plants. Never mind for human consumption. A child in the Gaza Strip with a curable disease will die. A child with the same disease a mile away in an Israeli settlement, in an Israeli city, will live. And the distance between these two children and perfectly good healthcare facilities is the same distance. That is the reality we're talking about. Now you add to that constant bombing, starvation, imprisonment, torture. If you look at the rates of survival of women's breast cancer in the Gaza Strip and compare those rates to Israel, and the reason there's a difference, you'd be shocked. The only reason there's a difference is access. Israel decides who has access and who does not. Based on what? One thing. If you're Palestinian, it means you don't have access. Of course, they wrap it up in security and all kinds of nonsense, but it's complete nonsense. This idea that somehow Palestinians pose a security threat to Israel has always been absurd. Palestinians have never had a military force. Israel has an enormous military. How can Palestinians possibly pose a military threat, a security threat? In the Negev Desert, which is the southern part of the country, Really, it's about half of the country is the Nakab Desert. It's a very fertile desert. If you've been there, you know. In the winter, it's a beautiful desert. It's all green. The ethnic cleansing campaign that the local Palestinian Bedouins suffered was enormous. The ethnic cleansing campaign of the Bedouin was cruel and continues to this day, by the way, because the Nakab is so fertile, because the land is so rich. Now, the Bedouin who remained, the Palestinian Bedouin who remained, became Israeli citizens. They're about, in the Nakab, about 200, close to 200,000. Half of them, about 100,000, reside in towns that are called unrecognized towns. What's an unrecognized town? Either there's a town or there isn't a town. What's an unrecognized town? What does that even mean? Well, these are towns that existed, that preceded the state of Israel. And the Palestinians refused to be relocated. So they get no services. So imagine 100,000 people who are citizens receive no electricity, no water, no healthcare facilities, no educational facilities, although recently they've been allowed to build some schools, no roads. If there's an emergency and you need an ambulance, there's no road. There's no map that indicates where the towns are. They don't exist. Because they dared not to be willing to be relocated. Then there's another 100,000 who were relocated and are now in one particular part of the Nakab. And they live in townships in extreme poverty. Why are they in extreme poverty? Because they're forbidden from working in agriculture, which is their main source of livelihood, always was. The Nakab Bedouin, especially in the unrecognized towns, when they need water, they need to buy the water at inflated prices. Now, all across the Nakab, and literally across the street from some of these townships, are Israeli colonies, Israeli towns, kibbutzim, cities. Beautiful, green, modern, exemplary. Really. And you literally can stand on the road and you see one side green and beautiful and modern, and one side dark and depressing and poor and impoverished. And the difference? One are Israeli Jews and the other ones are Palestinians. The Palestinian Bedouin, they consume camel's milk. Israelis don't. So they took away their camels and gave them to the Israeli colonies. They raise the camels and they sell the milk back to the Bedouin. This is a small example. Just a small example. And then generally speaking, if you've driven along the highways up and down across the country and you pay attention, you'll see that on the side of the road where you see the Israeli towns, the Israeli colonies, you can tell. And on the other side of the road where you see the Palestinian towns, you can tell. And one of the signs, which is that on the Palestinian homes, there are always these enormous black water tanks. Enormous black water tanks that are used to store water. Israelis don't even know that these water tanks are needed or exist. Only if they pay attention, they see, I wonder why these Arabs have these big water tanks. Well, who knows? But why is it that Israelis don't need these water tanks and the Palestinians do, and they live across the street from each other, and they're all sometimes Israeli citizens? The Israeli Water Authority, you may have heard of it, it's called Mekorot. It's one of these marvels that Israel exports because it made the desert bloom. They control all the water in the country. And they allocate 3% of the water to the Palestinian population. Now, Palestinians make up the majority of the population in historic Palestine. 3% of the water to the majority of the population. So obviously they need those tanks to store the water when it does run. Now, what this means is that what this translates into practically is that you're going to have an Israeli colony on one side of the road, which is green and modern and beautiful, And on the other side of the road, you're going to have a Palestinian town that gets 12 hours or 10 hours or 15 hours of running water per week. Now, imagine if you have a family, the need for water. Obviously, you have different priorities. If you know you're only going to get 12 hours of running per week, and you also don't exactly know when the water will be made available. And literally across the street, there's access to all the water they could possibly want. And what this creates is the impression that one side is modern and developed, and the other side is backwards and dirty. Because if all you do is look at it without digging down and trying to understand why it is this way, you don't know about the 3% water. Most people don't. But what they do see is the Israeli Jewish side developed and sophisticated and modern, and the other side backward and dirty. That's it. That's what we know about the Arabs. And that's how you can perpetuate this lie that the Jews, the Zionists, made the desert bloom. And if it was up to the Arabs, it would still remain, backward and so forth. Even though anybody who is old enough to remember, or anybody who's willing to read a book or look at some pictures, can see that before 1948, Palestine was a thriving country with a booming economy, highly educated population, newspapers and culture and cinema and theater and everything else. But, we don't want to confuse this story with actual facts. And so we leave that aside. So we have the genocide going on, we have an ethnic cleansing that goes on, and we have an apartheid regime that has been put in place, and everybody treats it like it's a real democracy, like everything is fine. Then, of course, the question comes up is, well, what do we do? What can we do? Peace talks are nonsense because it's not a question of war and peace. The issue is not war. The issue is the committing of crimes against humanity by one side against the other. A nation with an enormous army against a nation that never had a tank. Yet pretends the story that somehow Israelis are under a security threat by Palestinians, the more you think about it, the more absurd you realize it is. Absurd to a level that is beyond belief. 2.5 million people in Gaza who don't have enough water to drink, clean water, present a security threat that justifies all this bombing and all this killing, yet they get away with this crime. But what is the answer? Peace talks are obviously not the answer because it's not a question of war here. It's a question of oppression. So Palestinians gave us a gift. They told us what we should do. They told us how we can help. They actually came out with a plan. And they said, here is what we need you to do. Here is what you can do to help. Boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Or BDS. These three letters that have become so, demonized. In Israel, if you say these three letters, even in any other context, people freak out. BDS. Palestinians told us what we can do. Boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Now, it wasn't just thrown out there as kind of a simple idea. There are actually very specific and clear demands for the call. For the BDS call. Very clear, very specific demands. Ending the military occupation in parts of Palestine that still exists. Allowing the refugees to return to their homes and their land. And equal rights, God forbid. Equal rights. In other words, it's all remedial. These are all very sensible, very realistic, very peaceful demands that clearly are designed to improve the reality in which Palestinians live today as a result of the state of Israel. The refugee issue, the occupation, and the apartheid. Allowing the refugees to return, dismantling the occupation, the military regime, and allowing for equal rights. Now, you may have heard that this is anti-Semitic. Some people, great experts, politicians, heads of parties, senators in the United States, leaders of communities, stand up and say that this is anti-Semitic. And my question is, please show me. Show me the anti-Semitism. Never mind the fact that Jews are not even mentioned in the demands. There's no mention of kicking or deporting or killing or throwing away or taking out or anything like that. It's all about remedying the situation. Where's the anti-Semitism? Justice, freedom, equality. Where's the anti-Semitism? And nobody can show it to me. Nobody's been able to point it out because it doesn't exist. The claim that somehow the call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel is anti-Semitic is absurd. The claim that somehow pointing out that Israel is a racist project, a racist state, is not anti-Semitic. Saying that it is absolutely absurd. Saying that the fight for justice in Palestine is anti-Semitic is absurd. It's a fight against racism. If you're fighting against racism, it can't be anti-Semitic. Anti-Semitism is a form of racism. Although, of course, now they've changed the definition to mean something strange, different. It is absolutely the morally right thing to do. It is absolutely the most dedicated and method, and also a method that has a track record. In South Africa, everybody that I met in South Africa told me BDS, without BDS, we would still have apartheid. Everybody I met in South Africa said the same thing. Which is why in South Africa, the BDS movement is so strong. Because now they feel it's their duty, it's their role to help Palestine. So Palestinians have given us the answer. All we need to do now is do it. Stop arguing about whether it's anti-Semitic, whether it's right, whether it's wrong. Of course it's right. It's a fight against racism. It's a fight against oppression, and it hurts no one. Will Israelis be inconvenienced as a result of the right of return? Perhaps. You know, there are entire Palestinian towns and communities that were left intact. The buildings, you know, there's Enkarem in Jerusalem, Ein Hod in the north, Safad, other places where they created these artist colonies, or boutique hotels, or beautiful oriental restaurants. Well, if you've been operating in somebody else's property for 7 decades and you didn't pay rent, it's likely you're going to be asked to pay up. But there's nothing wrong with that. A little justice never hurt anyone. But somehow to claim that these demands and by the way, nobody talks about the demands. They say the BDS is anti-Semitic, and that's it. And the way they reach that, and this is also one of these unbelievable stories. So I found out recently that when Israeli high school kids go overseas on student exchange groups, they have to take an online course that will prepare them for the challenges that they'll be facing, like claims of apartheid, like BDS, and so on. So I signed up and I took the course. Of course, I want to understand what BDS is. So they explained they've got the Minister of Education, they've got all these important people who are giving these little 10-minute clips on video clips. And the explanation about BDS is as follows. BDS is what they call a green-red alliance. A green-red alliance. Green representing extremist, jihadist Muslims, and red representing left-wing radical communists. And these two groups created an alliance because they're anti-Semitic and they want to destroy Israel. That's BDS. That's BDS. That's how Israel explains BDS. So now when these high school kids go overseas, they'll be able to explain it to their friends and everybody will see it for what it really is. Just really an anti-Semitic kind of a organization that has no value. There's nothing to do with justice or freedom. That's all nonsense. Because obviously there's no justice or freedom problem in Israel. That's how it's being taught. That's how it's being explained. But we should know the truth. We should know better. And so I think it's extremely important that people understand BDS. Go to the BDS website, bds.org or something, and check out their campaigns and see what they do and start your own branch and implement it wherever you live. And even more importantly, make sure your elected representatives know that you demand that they adopt and heed the call for BDS. Elected officials need to know. I had this funny exchange or interaction with a British member of parliament, and I wore this badge, and you think he saw a vampire. He became white and he just said, no, 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 I disagree. I hadn't even opened my mouth yet. They need to know their constituents demand that they heed the call to BDS, that they support BDS, that they come out publicly supporting BDS, and that they wear these badges on top of that. Seriously, I mean, this is what we need to do. And when people come up with the claims that it's anti-Semitic, we can laugh at their face and keep doing the right work that we're supposed to do. Stay on task, because it's nonsense. It's not even deserving of an answer, of a reply. It is that absurd. Now, it makes me crazy when I still hear people talk about how this settlement or that settlement or this thing or that thing that Israel did is making the two-state solution even less likely. Excuse me? There's a two-state solution out there that is likely? There's a two-state solution out there somewhere that is possible, that was ever possible? The very existence of the state of Israel negates the possibility of a Palestinian state. The very ideology upon which Israel is built negates the possibility of rights for Palestinians. Because according to Zionist ideology, the land of Israel belongs to the Jewish people, all Jewish people. The Arabs are invaders. I don't know if perhaps you haven't heard, but the Arabs are the invaders. And this is the discourse, this is the language that is used today. The Arabs are invading our lands in Judea and Samaria. The Arabs are stealing our water in Judea and Samaria. The Arabs are building illegally in Judea and Samaria and all over the country. There was a campaign by a settler group in Judea and Samaria, because we don't call regular Israelis settlers, we don't want to hurt their feelings. We only call those Israelis settlers. So there was a campaign where one morning people who live in Judea and Samaria in the settlements woke up and they saw all of the highways. They saw Palestinian flags hanging on all the posts, on the light posts along the highways. And this was a campaign that was put together by a settler group. And after the shock, the first few hours of shock, they revealed that they did this. Why? To show them that if the state of Israel is not more forceful in holding down the Palestinians and preventing them from taking our land, they will wake up one day to a Palestinian state. And this is true, of course, not only in Judea and Samaria. This fear exists in the Negev, because they're stealing our lands in the Negev, and they're stealing our lands in the Galilee, and they're stealing our lands everywhere, these Arabs. This is the discourse. This is the campaign. Now, when I say it like this, it sounds ridiculous, but this is the reality. And I want to remind you, by the way, that over the last 7 decades, we've seen all of these things that seem ridiculous suddenly become a reality. Things that seem absurd suddenly become a reality. Things that we thought would never happen because they're so crazy and dangerous, and they become a reality. If anybody suggested, before it actually happened, that Israeli settlers will take over the old city of Hebron, that these armed, lunatic gangsters, violent, fanatic gangsters, will take over the old city of Hebron and terrorize the Palestinians, thousands and thousands and thousands of Palestinians who live in this. People will say it's absurd, it'll never happen. It's not going to happen. 10 years ago, if somebody said America would move its embassy to Jerusalem, people would have laughed. They said, no, it's never happened. The Arab world will blow up. The Muslim world will never allow it to happen. It happened. Have you heard of anything happening as a result of that? And now, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, these groups that called to destroy Al-Aqsa and build a Jewish temple there were considered fringe. Today, they're in the cabinet. They're ministers in the cabinet. They sit in the Israeli cabinet has a small little group, which is called the Security Cabinet. They sit in that cabinet. These same people who 10, 20 years ago everybody thought were lunatic fringe because they called for the destruction of Al-Aqsa are now in the cabinet. There are plans. There's millions of dollars are being invested in planning this. Today we talk about it, see, oh, it's never going to happen. They will never allow it. And then 10 years go by and it's happened, and we look back and we didn't even notice that anything happened. And little by little by little, Palestine is being destroyed. To the point where it's bleeding to death. So the situation is severe on the one hand, but on the other hand, we do not have the luxury to say it's hopeless. We do not have the luxury to say, well, there's nothing we can do. Israel is too strong. America supports Israel. Of course, the UK supports Israel, even, historically even more. Then, what can we do? We do not have that luxury. We have an obligation, a moral obligation, to stand up and do everything we can to stop this. We have a moral obligation to make sure we see the siege on Gaza end. We have a moral obligation to see all Palestinian prisoners free. We have a moral obligation to see the refugees be allowed to return to their homes and their land. We do not have the right to say, no, sorry, it's too hard, there's nothing we can do. We don't have that right. And groups like this, organizations like this, are precisely the vehicle. And the call for BDS is the gift, is the roadmap that was given to us by Palestinians. So it's crucial that we act. It's crucial that we stand up. It's crucial that our elected officials know that we demand action. Not resolutions and, free Palestine stickers. Not solidarity. Solidarity is no longer enough. We need action. A patient is dying, is bleeding to death. Standing around and cheering them on is not going to do it. So generally speaking, I have to say, even with all this, I'm actually very hopeful. I'm hopeful for two reasons. Number one, I travel everywhere. Across the United States, around the world, and everywhere I go, I see rooms like this filled with people that you would think have no reason to care. And they sit there and they're engaged and they ask questions and they want to know what they can do. And every year, the crowds are bigger. There are more events, more lectures, and it's just me. There's a whole group of people that do, great people who give talks and events about this. And it grows and grows and grows, again, largely thanks to, PSC and groups like this here in the UK. So that has to be a cause for optimism, and it is. I'm also optimistic because I go to Palestine a lot. I spend a lot of time in Palestine. And Palestinians are the most hopeful, encouraging people I've ever met. Even in the Gaza Strip, where despair is beyond belief, where there's no reason to be hopeful. Everybody's got a PhD. Why would you get a PhD unless you're hopeful? Why would you get a PhD unless you're optimistic about the future? It's incredible. The hope, the sense that there is a future, that we should fight for this future. And I'll end with this. I want to invite everybody here. You may have noticed, I call the country Palestine. Some people call it Israel. And I want to invite everybody here to start calling it Palestine. Not Israel, Palestine, Palestine, Israel, none of that nonsense. Because the determination of how we call that country, the way we should determine which name we use, has to be based on our values. It has nothing to do with religion or politics. It has to do with our values. If we call it Israel, we're legitimizing crimes against humanity. If we call it Israel, we're legitimizing the genocide, the ethnic cleansing, the apartheid regime, the brutality, the violence, the racism. That's what Israel is. There's no nice pie-in-the-sky liberal Israel. That's a myth. So by calling it Israel, we're legitimizing all of that. If we call it Palestine, we're supporting the people of Palestine, and that's what they call it. The indigenous population of Palestine, the Palestinians call it Palestine. That's the name of the country that has been for a very, very long time. So it's a question of values. So I would invite everybody here to call it Palestine and stand up and make sure that every single one of us does everything we can so that we see a free Palestine and that we see it soon. Thank you very much.
Wow, I just want to say thank you so much, Miko, for that very powerful, very moving, but also very energizing speech. And I think we have so much to take away. We'd like to take some questions. If you could try and keep them short, we'll try and get through as many as possible.
I think what we should do is do 3 at a time. If you don't mind, I'll use your notepad.
Yes, 3 at a time. Go ahead.
And
Yeah.
This goes a little quicker.
So,
Let's use it quicker.
yeah, go for it. Yeah. So, yeah, one here. Yes. Would you like to stand up, speak loudly?
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to start my question by just proceeding about something. I'm the son of rabbi and cousin and all sorts of Jewish tradition, but I trained with an Arabic teacher for 40 years. So I teach Sufi workshops all over the world. And I'm planning to go to Israel soon to teach there.
He can make his choice.
I'm not quite ready.
He can make his own choice.
So my question, okay. I believe in peace and humanitarianism as much as any other human being. Obviously I feel a little bit uncomfortable about this talk in some ways. My closest friends are Arabic. I've studied the Quran in depth. My question, I wanted to give this as background, it's very important.
Okay, if you could just give the
that's
question,
fine.
Laurie.
I don't get too personal,
Yeah.
but we're here. So, in some ways, I think your talk was absolutely marvellous, and I'd love to talk to you more about it and see what I can do to help. But in some ways, I feel as if Israel, Palestine, whatever you want to call it, has been demonized a little bit. And my question really centers around the fact my mother was Kindertrack school, so I grew up having to sort of bear the traumas of hearing about what happened in the war. And I know of many Jewish people in Israel who are doing a lot of good peace work. And in a way, people come away from this talk feeling as if Israel is just this awful, terrible place. Palestine, call it what you want. I want nothing more than peace, but there are certain realities about certain people who do not accept the existence of Israel and would prefer to bomb and kill the Jews. I think there are certain people, and probably the minority. So my question, I suppose, is really about the fact, what do you see as a positive solution? I feel as if you've kind of created a dichotomy between this awful country and so what do you see?
The positive solution.
What is the solution?
Okay.
Because I'd like to be part of it.
Thank you, Laurie.
And can you paint a slightly more positive picture about Israel in your next talk, please? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Yes. Yes, yes.
Yeah, I'd like to hear from Miko an update of that government of that state called
Israel?
yeah, the latest, there was
The latest on the political situation
Because it
since the latest election. So an update politically? Yes. Number 3.
I have 2 questions. One, what do you think about Netanyahu who want to take more land from the Palestinians? Second, why the United Nations didn't take any sanction against Israel?
Did you get that, Miko?
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's do these 3 and then. Okay. Good questions. So the sense of discomfort that people get from my talk, I won't apologize for it. I think it's positive. I think that it's we need to feel a sense of discomfort, particularly if we come from a background that sees Israel in a positive light. I think this negative, this discomfort is important. Now, it doesn't feel good, obviously. It's a little bit awkward. But I think it's important to put it in context. And the context is not that all Israeli people are bad people. I mean, I'm an Israeli. And this creation of Israelis really is a new creation. Israelis are not all Jews. Israelis are a very particular group of people. It's really a new nation that was established, that was created by the Zionists. We're like the whites in South Africa in a way. We're not from we're not indigenous. We are the result of a process of settler colonialism and racism and so forth, but now that's it. The whites in South Africa are South Africans. Israelis are now part of the landscape in Palestine. And the reality that I see, and the reality of all of all the people I talk to, Palestinians and others who view the situation the way I do, the conversation is not about causing harm to Israelis or causing harm to anyone, but it's coming to the very, very clear understanding that Israelis cannot continue to live with privilege. The reality in Palestine cannot continue. There will be no peace for anyone as long as Israelis insist on maintaining their privilege. That cannot be tolerated. That must not be tolerated. This idea that all Jews have a right to Palestine, yet Palestinians have no right to return or have no rights there if they live there. That is not a reality that any of us should be willing to accept. Now, it's interesting because they talk a lot about separation. Israelis talk a lot about separation. We need to separate from the Arabs. Well, if you want to separate from the Arabs, there's no place for you in an Arab country. Palestine is an Arab country that we came to, that my grandparents came to. Well, they came to an Arab country and now they want to live separate and segregated from Arabs. That's not going to work unless you maintain a very strict segregation and a very strict apartheid regime. The other thing that has come up, it came up in a speech during the labor conference in Brighton a couple of weeks ago with Hanin Zahabi. You know, they're trying to de-Arabize the country, and the process of de-Arabizing Palestine has been ongoing. The destruction of towns, destruction of monuments, destruction of villages, changing of the names of towns, changing of the names of streets, allowing monuments to either fall apart or destroying them, changing the history, eliminating the Palestinian history, not even teaching it to not even allowing Palestinians to learn it. And her comment was, if they want to live in Europe, if they want to live in an environment that is European, why did they come here? Europe is there. There's no adhan, there's no call for prayer in Europe. Why are you here if you don't like the call for prayer? If you do not like the Muslim call for prayer in the morning, why are you in Palestine? And I think it's a very valid point. To be a settler colonizer, you cannot have legitimacy. You cannot beg and ask the world to accept you as legitimate if this is what you do. Now, I think there is a very, very good possibility of a positive outcome, a positive solution that will be good for everyone. A real democracy with equal rights, with one person, one vote, that will allow for the creation of a single state, which is a real democracy. When you have, like I said, one person, one vote, and a real parliament, a House of Representatives that represents all the people, all 12 million or so people who live there. A government that represents all the people. I think that'd be a very good outcome. I think it'd be a first step. In other words, once you have a representative government, that'll be the first time in the history of Palestine. Once we have that, now they're going to be able to solve all the problems. The right of return, compensation, citizenship, and on and on and on. Rebuilding of Gaza and all of this. But they'll be able to do it together. I had this conversation with Hanin Zahabi actually, because she was a member of Knesset for 10 years. Israel is all a single voting district. There are no districts in Israel. It's all one voting district. So you vote for a party, the party decides who goes in to the Knesset. But really, to make it a democracy, you have to have voting districts. Now the population exists within the country, the two populations, the communities are very close. You couldn't possibly create a voting district that is clearly one or the other. So you're going to have a voting district where you've got Palestinians and Israelis voting together. Now, how would people vote? Okay, I'm a father, I have children, I have a business. There's certain things that I want my parliamentarian to fight for. Good roads, clean water, the environment, education, and so on. If my Palestinian neighbor, what does he want? What does she want? Good roads, low taxes, clean water. Are we going to vote based on ethnic considerations, or are we going to vote based on our common mutual expectations? That's how you have a positive outcome. When you have a real democracy, when you have real equality, and you present the possibility of that to the entire people, all the people who live there. Then you can have Israelis and Palestinians, I think, live together and have a very bright future. There's no question about that. Israelis and Palestinians can live together in peace. There's no question about that.
I agree, but what does Hamas say to that?
Hold on. Israelis and Palestinians can live together in peace. Absolutely. There's no question. Hamas says that as well. But not as long as one side claims privilege. Not as long as one side claims privilege. And then I think the future could be very, very bright. So I hope that answers your question. I'm sure you have many more, and maybe we can talk later. Now, Israeli the political reality in Israel. If you've been paying attention, you know that over the last 6 months, Israel had elections twice, and surprise, surprise, they had the exact same results. Well, what do you expect? Why would the results change? The expectation that if you wait 6 more months, have another elections, you'll have different results is absolutely stupid and wasteful. But, stupid and wasteful is exactly what Israeli politicians are about. And so that's what we have today. Now, the really only realistic expectation, unless they go for elections again, which would be absolutely crazy, is for the two big parties to do what they've done in the past and create what they call a national unity government, where we put away our differences and we all sit together, one big happy family, and we all sit around the government table, which will allow them a real majority, and they will allow them to do everything they want to do. Now, the reason this is unrealistic is because most of the political parties, the only differences between them is that they want to be the ones who are in the prime minister's seat, as opposed to having somebody else in the prime minister's seat. Ideologically, they're all the same. One big party is run by a war criminal former general, the other one by a war criminal former prime minister, who gave that general the orders, by the way. Ideologically, there's no differences between them, and they kept saying, we're perfectly happy to sit together, but we don't like Netanyahu, or we don't like this guy. Well, as much as nobody likes Netanyahu, and I don't think his wife likes him either, the point is that they're not going to have a choice. It's very likely that he will continue to be prime minister, and all of these people end up working for him as government in their cabinet positions. And I think also Israeli politicians don't go into politics typically to be in the opposition. They go into politics because they want to be prime minister, they want to be minister of this, they want to be minister of that. So I think the only realistic expectation is that in the end they will all, hold hands, and the president of the state will announce that he finally created this, kumbaya, and everybody's going to live together, and they can kill and oppress and destroy Palestine all together, which is really what they're all about, with maybe some slight differences. So that's what I think we can expect. There's really no other way, because neither one of them can form a majority without the other. What was the third question about Netanyahu taking land and
The UN.
no sanction. Yeah, well, the UN nobody can sanction Israel as long as the UK and the US and all these other countries support it so wholeheartedly. And the UN has no teeth anyway, so the United Nations can pass any resolution it wants. There's no way to enforce. So they can't really enforce this. The only power that we have that exists is for us as grassroots to push up and push up and push up and force the issue up the food chain until it becomes front and center, until they can't ignore us anymore. And ignoring us, by the way, is something that they're very good at. And I'll give you two quick examples. One is, you may have heard that there's been several countries that have recognized the state of Palestine. And everybody's cheering, and the Palestinian flags are waving, and you go, excuse me, what did you just do? Who did you recognize? There's a state of Palestine that we've never heard of? Where is it? Who are the citizens? What are the boundaries? Where is the state of Palestine? What are you talking about? There's a Palestinian Authority that has absolutely zero authority. They have a president who cannot even go from Ramallah to Bethlehem without a permit from an Israeli army officer. That's a state? That's what you recognized? This recognition is an attempt to appease us. This recognition exists because they know the constituents demand action. Well, they found the perfect formula. They can do something that is perfectly safe. They will make absolutely no difference whatsoever, and they can tell us, well, look, what do you want? We recognize Palestine. The recognition that we need to demand is a recognition that Palestine has been occupied, oppressed, subjected to ethnic cleansing and genocide for 7 decades, and that this agency, which is called the State of Israel, that has been doing this, needs to be stopped. That's the resolution we want to see. And I've seen this, the last 3 years I've been present at the Labour Party conferences. And they've done the same thing. They've got all these resolutions. The last conference 2 weeks ago, they had a resolution recognizing the right of return. Okay, so what does that mean? If Corbyn becomes prime minister and all of his allies have been suspended because of anti-Semitism claims, he's not going to be able to do anything. So again, they're trying to calm us down. They're trying to make us shut up by accepting all these, passing these resolutions, which mean nothing in the end. So we need to push for action that actually has meaning. The American Sixth Fleet, the British Navy need to be in the Gaza Strip now, saving people. There needs to be a no-fly zone over the Gaza Strip. People in Gaza need to be saved on aircraft carriers. That's the kind of action we need to see immediately. Sanctions, immediate stopping of the arms sales to Israel. Things that actually matter. Making sure that British teams cannot play Israeli teams in any sport. That's how people feel that there's difference, that there's a chance for a difference. That's the kind of things we need to demand. And then the UN hopefully will grow some claws as well and be able to do something.
Thank you very much. Should we take... Three more questions. We have a lot of questions. Yes.
I just wanted to ask, PDS, what does it mean?
BDS.
Boycott, divestment and sanctions.
Divestment and sanctions, yes. To boycott means to refuse to buy the products or goods. Yes, boycott. Yes. Divest, not invest in the companies, and sanctions, like international sanctions.
Okay, and the D and the S?
Divest and sanctions. Yes. Yes?
Can I just ask how you feel, ordinary Israelis feel, about the weaponisation of the term anti-Semitism in a country where they're even killing Semitic people called Palestinians, in a country where Falasha Jews were welcomed until it was realised they were black and they now sterilise their women folk, and where the Lemba tribe are not welcome from South Africa because they have more Jewish genes than the Israelis, but are black.
Did you get that?
Yeah. Indeed, the fact they won't allow the rabbis from the Jewish Voice for Peace to travel to Israel because they're anti-Semitic.
Yes.
You mentioned 2 or 3 things that were conflict between Israel and Palestine, allowing the military forces to come out, allowing the refugees back in, etc. What's going to be the defining moment that makes Israel go, you know what, we need to start
What will it take?
What they need and what they want. What's going to be the light bulb moment? Yeah, basically.
Thank you. And this gentleman at the front, yes.
I spent a bit of time in February and January this year, and I was talking with a soldier.
With which group?
I took myself, staying in a heavy.
Okay, cool.
In the old city. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was.
Start from the beginning.
So I spent a bit of time in Hebron in January this year, a few days. I was staying in the old city with a Palestinian woman, right on Shahuda Street on a rooftop. And you could see I was next to an IDF base, but, you know, on the other side of the wall, so to speak, you know. And I was talking with an Israeli soldier, and I'm just interested to know, I said, do you kind of enjoy it? You know, what you do? Do you like this as a job? Sorry. He was 19, and he said no. And we kind of got on to talking about refusal, you know, in the military. And I was wondering what are the kind of punishments that Israelis see who stand up to, you know, not doing their military service. Not so much just the imprisonment, but also how it will affect their lives after in employment and things like that. And also how, I'm sure you're obviously aware of breaking the silence and combatants for peace and how they're received in Israeli society as well. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Miko?
Yeah. The first question you started with Israeli, how Israelis view this, right? That's how you started your question. How Israelis view this, yeah. Okay, well, I remember talking about this issue of the anti-Semitism thing with my son, and he reminded me that when they call you names, that means they have nothing else to say. That's what the anti-Semitism is. There is no argument that could possibly legitimize what Israel does. So the only way for them to respond is by attacking, by calling us names. So we're anti-Semitic and we're that thing and the other thing. But of course, it's complete nonsense. Like you said, Jewish Voice for Peace, which is a Jewish organization, is on the list of anti-Semitic organizations that are blacklisted and are not permitted to enter Israel by the Israeli authorities. That's, you know, they're fighting a battle that they cannot possibly win, which is, of course, good news for justice. But somebody last night asked me, what are the chances that we could one day call for justice for Palestinians and not be accused of anti-Semitism? There's no such thing. If anybody expects to stand up for Palestine and be part of the struggle and not be called anti-Semitic and not have to face this kind of, vehement meanness, then they should step out and do something else, because it's only going to get worse. The accusations of anti-Semitism are only going to get worse. The mudslinging is only going to get worse. The accusations of God knows what else against Jeremy Corbyn are going to get worse when it seems clear that he's actually going to be prime minister. We have not even seen the beginning of this. It is going to be dirtier and dirtier because they are fighting for their life. The minute, and they know this, the minute that the narrative, this holy grail, which is the Zionist biblical narrative, collapses, that's the end of the legitimacy of the state of Israel. And without their legitimacy, they have nothing. So they are going to fight this with everything they've got, and they've got a lot. They have a war chest that is larger and richer than anything we could possibly imagine. Now, there was another bit that added to the Israeli legitimacy, and this was a pretense that they went along with for a very long time, that Israel is a peaceful country that wants peace with its neighbors. Over the last 10 years, it became clear that that is a lie. In other words, they're not even pretending that they want peace anymore. This is what Netanyahu really brought to the table. He dropped the facade. So that has already caused a chink in a serious crack in the legitimacy. If it goes on, then that's it, it's over. And once the legitimacy goes, that is precisely the moment you were asking about, that people are going to realize, well, why are we allowing this to happen? Why are we allowing this racist endeavor to go on in Palestine? Now, in terms of Israelis don't really care about this stuff. They know that there's good guys and bad guys. There's all these BDS. They call it the BDS. The BDS. The BDS is everybody, it's us, it's people who support Palestine in general. It's the BDS. They did one of the Israeli TV channels did a program, a 5-part actually news program, a year or 2 years ago in the U.S. about the BDS in the U.S. And the BDS are all the Palestine solidarity groups on campuses and churches, actual BDS people. They even found me and interviewed me. So that's the BDS. That's how Israelis view it. And the BDS is, of course, bad. And they hate us, and they're anti-Semitic, and well, that's really, it's very superficial and very shallow, the conversation in general. Of course, there are individuals who do get it. And I think the defining moment that you talked about is going to be precisely that, when they realize, when people around the world realize there's no legitimacy to this. There is no legitimacy to the state of Israel. There is no legitimacy to the violence. We cannot condone it anymore. And you know, it's simple things. There's a campaign, there's a football campaign to kick Israel out of FIFA, basically, and not allow Israel to play football anymore. I know in South Africa, when they couldn't play rugby, they couldn't play football, they couldn't participate in the Olympics. That's the kind of thing that touches people. That's when people stop and think. And I think the defining moment is probably going to be something that simple.
Is there one issue within that particular?
I don't know. It's impossible for nobody knows.
No, I mean, when you get to the final end goal,
Yeah.
which is what everyone wants,
Yeah.
ideally, no Palestine person within they see are going to agree to become Israel.
No, of course not. No, of course not. No. No, of course not.
Those that within Israel are not going to agree to become Palestinian.
Yeah, however...
Therefore, how do you bridge the narrative?
Okay.
Make a new name?
Okay.
You know,
I get it. Well,
no one's going to agree to one,
yeah.
no one's going to agree to the other.
True. Agreeing is not the issue. We do have, in this case, there is a right and a wrong. As hard as it may be for some people to hear, in this particular case, there is a right and a wrong. Settler colonialism, racism, violence are wrong. The rights of indigenous people to freedom and democracy and equality and justice is right. And now, if somebody disagrees with that, there's nothing I can do about that. But basically, this is the perspective that I present. Now, Israelis will never agree to anything. They never have. The only way, and by the way, if we had waited for the whites in South Africa to agree to end apartheid, Nelson Mandela would have died on Robben Island, right? So it's not a question of getting to agree, it's a question of getting them to realize there's a new reality. And again, BDS is the thing. And what happened in South Africa, one day, it reached a point where they knew there was nowhere to go. And then de Klerk, who was president, not because he was a saint, not because he suddenly woke up one morning feeling good about the world, had no choice. And he stood up in front of a podium and he ended apartheid. He said, we're going to free the prisoners, we're going to allow the political parties to run freely, and we are calling for a one-person, one-vote election. That was the end of apartheid, basically. And I believe it's going to happen exactly the same way when an Israeli prime minister, and it might even be this one, Netanyahu, stands up to a podium and says, but they're not going to say it because he wakes up one morning feeling good. He's going to wake up one morning and there's nowhere to go. It's over. And when it's over, that's when they're going to do it. What is exactly going to get him to that moment, nobody knows. But I do know this. If we sat here and it was 1988 or even 1989, and somebody said Nelson Mandela will be president of South Africa by 1994, we would have laughed. We would have laughed. And 6 years went by, and 6 years is a very short time, and Mandela was not only free, but he was president of South Africa. So once things do change, they move quite quick, quite fast. Now, the refusal to serve is a very important question. I'm glad you brought that up. And there's two parts to the answer. Israelis like myself, I wish I refused. If I knew then what I know today, I should have absolutely refused to serve. And there is no justification whatsoever to serve in the Israeli military. There is no justification. Young Israelis today who are, secular, normal Israelis, if they decide to refuse to serve as a conscientious objector, because Israel does not recognize conscientious objectors. There's no such thing in Israel. So if you claim that you're a conscientious objector, you're going to go to jail. If you say that you're crazy, that you wet your bed, that you want your mommy, that's fine. You will be let out because they don't want people like that in the army. But if you say you have a conscience, you will go to jail. So they go to jail. Typically, I think they go to jail for like 30 days, and then they come out, they have another try, and they go back to another 30 days, and after maybe 2 or 3 of those, they're dismissed. And for a while there, you're going to be tagged as a refuser, and because everywhere you go, they ask you about your military service. If you go to university, if you want a mortgage, when you got to get a loan, you want to buy a car, you want a driver's license, anything you go, the first thing they ask you, because that's how they know for sure if you're Israeli or an Arab. Because if you didn't serve, why didn't you serve? Oh, we look at your last name, you're an Arab, you go over there. And if you're an Israeli, well, the impact is not that punitive. It's worth it. It's worth doing the right thing because the consequence is, look, when you come from privilege and you decide to do the right thing, there are some consequences, but they're not grave. These are not consequences that you cannot live with, And so, and I know many people who refuse, not many, but I know a few people who refuse to serve, sadly not many, and they teach at the university and they have jobs and they're fine, So there is no justification for not refusing. Now that's the first part of the answer. Second part of the answer is this. Israel has a very large ultra-Orthodox community. The UK has an ultra-Orthodox Jewish community, and in the United States there's an even larger one. And traditionally the ultra-Orthodox communities have always opposed the state of Israel. They've been anti-Zionist across the board, historically, and to a very large degree they still are. Now, Israel had the status quo, whereas they were exempt from the military. The truth is the military didn't want them, and they didn't want the military, so it was kind of a happy divorce. About 10 years ago, an Israeli politician by the name of Yair Lapid decided to build his career on this one issue that he knew was going to be explosive. Because most Israelis, secular Israelis like myself, look at that community of Orthodox Jews and hate their guts. We hate them because they look Jewish, we hate them because they're old-fashioned, we hate them because they don't serve in the army, and we hate them because they don't like the state and they actually burn the Israeli flag on Independence Day. So we hate them. And really, and I know this sounds maybe a bit harsh, but Israeliness is defined by hatred of Arabs and hatred of the ultra-Orthodox Jews. That's really what defines you in many ways as an Israeli. And again, not all Israelis. I'll accept that. So he brought that up, and it became an issue, and the demand was to change the law. Because these parasites, they live at our expense, and they don't even serve, and we have to protect them from all these Arabs that want to kill us, and they don't even serve. And they created a reality today that every 17-year-old boy and girl in that community is a deserter. Because they won't even go, before you're actually conscripted, you're called 3 times. 1 time to register, 1 time for something else, and 1 time when you actually go. They refuse to go at all. And so what the army does, it's not the army, it's the police. They go into their neighborhoods and they look for deserters. And they grab them by the beards and yank them and beat the hell out of these guys at 2 o'clock in the morning, very similar to what they do with Palestinians. And this community protests and stands up, thousands of them. And they say, we will not serve in your army. You hear nothing of this. Nothing of this. One Israeli that looks like me refuses to serve. It's all over social media. What a great hero. Look at her. Look at him. These guys by the thousands are being persecuted by the Israeli police. And I swear to you, if you see the videos of what goes on when the mounted police on horseback come into those neighborhoods and start smashing skulls, it's beyond belief. Okay? They stand heroically, and they throw them in jail, and they put them in solitary, and they refuse to even put when you're in a military jail, you have to wear a uniform. They refuse to wear the uniform in the military jail. And, beyond belief what they go through. And they stand up. And they suffer much more than anybody who looks like me would suffer, because everybody hates them anyway. And that is heroic, the way they stand. And they stand because of principle. They are conscientious objectors. They say our religion prohibits us from carrying arms. Our religion prohibits us from the Zionist state. And we won't do it. But again, that's the tragedy. The tragedy of that story is that they don't get any press because nobody wants to see Israeli police going into Jewish neighborhoods where they look like Jews, and get beat up by Israeli police, by police who have the Star of David. And I'll say just one more thing about that community. I've been in touch with them a lot over the last couple of years. I'm writing a book about them. And they've been very gracious and very helpful. And there's a great community in London, a great community in the US, and a great community in Jerusalem, of course. There's this claim that somehow Israel is a refuge for Jews. It's the only safe place for Jews. And there's a rabbi in London, Rabbi Beck. He's a very well-known, very highly regarded rabbi. And he says, I've been living in the UK for 35 years. I don't know what a British soldier looks like. I've never seen one. Every Israeli child in Jerusalem knows what a soldier looks like, knows what different kinds of guns they have, and you're telling me that it's safer for me over there than it is over here? And that's a very powerful statement. But they refuse to serve, and they pay the consequences.
Just quickly on that, they start a brigade like a few years ago to try and attract.
Yes, they do. There are very strong efforts by the state of Israel to force them in. They actually have a brigade of ultra-Orthodox Jews. They do, yeah.
I think we'll just take 3 more questions.
Good idea, because I'm losing my voice.
Yeah, okay. There was a gentleman at the back who wanted to speak, and I don't know if he's gone. Would you like to say a question? Right at the far back. Yeah. Yeah, sure.
That is one way of actually achieving the goals and convincing lots of people in the US to get as much support as they can. So what action has been taken in Israel as far as challenging this paranoia?
You got that, Miko? Yeah?
Yeah, I got that.
Okay, yes.
I think so.
One more question, sorry. Please. Since you served in the Israeli army, did you ever shoot a Palestinian?
Thank you. Yes.
As far as I know, Netanyahu wants to annex west of the Palestine land. If I want to know, how would they create biggest great struggle without invading some other country? Do they have any countries in target?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm sorry, you've already asked a question.
Great speech, thank you. But have you any suggestions? I mean, from what you said today, you would have been expelled from the British Labour Party 10 times over. Do you have any suggestions about advice to Labour Party members to overcome this Gordian knot that's being tied around their freedom of speech? And the other comment I had was a joke was at one of these meetings earlier. I think the young man's left now, but the proposed new name for the merged state.
Oh, yeah.
Just transpose the E and the N at the end of Palestine.
Thank you. Okay. Over to you, Miko.
Yeah. So the theory that somehow the oppressed have become the oppressors is not really true. And I'll tell you why. The vast majority of Holocaust survivors did not go to Israel. Only a small fraction of Holocaust survivors actually went to what became Israel, and many of them left after this, as soon as they could, for many reasons, and I won't get into that. But the reality is that out of maybe 2 million or so survivors that were in camps in Europe after World War II, maybe less than 10% actually went to what became Israel, and many of them were forced because they were young, and so the Zionist organizations took the youth and brought them there, and then many of those left. So it is not true that Israelis are the descendants of oppressed people. Israelis were never oppressed. Maybe my grandparents' parents were oppressed, or maybe my grandparents suffered some, but Israelis have never suffered any kind of oppression. However, there is a cynical use there always has been a cynical use by the Zionists of the Holocaust. There has been very cynical use of the trauma that Jews did go through anti-Semitism and the Holocaust and so forth. But there's no campaign to end it. In fact, the campaign is to deepen the sense of trauma in young Israelis, even though they've never been through any kind of persecution. So they go to Auschwitz and they teach them about this, and they tell them, look around you, every single person here on the outside is probably a Nazi or the son of a Nazi, and that sort of thing. And again, if you dare to stray from the very, very clear version of the Holocaust and what transpired in the Holocaust and the role of the Zionist movement during the Holocaust, if you dare to stray from the official line, boom, you're a Holocaust denier and you're anti-Semitic and you're looking at one. I'm both. I'm a Holocaust denier and I'm anti-Semitic, because the line that was drawn by the Zionists in terms of that narrative is false. It's false in many, many ways. Not to say that there was no Holocaust, but to say that the way the Zionists are describing it and the way that the Zionists are presenting it and their own role within it is open to a lot of debate and a lot of questions. And so that's I think that's an important point to remember, that Israel is not made of Holocaust survivors. However, they do push the trauma and the paranoia, and they've just added, about a year ago, one of the Israeli cabinet members, celebrated on Twitter that the Israeli Ministry of Education just added a chapter about the Holocaust of the Sephardic Jews. Sephardic Jews are Arab Jews, except we can't say Arab because it's a bad word, so we call them Sephardic as though they came from Spain. Or we call them Oriental Jews as though they came from, China. But we can't say Arab Jews. And what's interesting is that many of the Arab Jews came from countries that are actually west of Israel, west of Palestine, but they still call them Oriental. Because, of course, it's all a very Eurocentric kind of thinking. It's all Eurocentric. So anything that is not white must be Oriental. Anyway, so the Holocaust of the Arab Jews. What Holocaust of the Arab Jews? There was no such thing. Holocaust of the Sephardic Jews did not exist. But now the Ministry of Education in Israel is teaching about how the Jews in Arab countries also suffered from a Holocaust. Because we all need to have that trauma in order to maintain the Zionist myth that allows us to kill Palestinians. That is that kind of a madness. So that's how they deal with that trauma, which of course is terrible. Now, there are all these theories about Israel wanting to create, some kind of a greater Israel that includes other Arab countries. I don't think there's any truth to it whatsoever. The land of Israel is defined as Palestine, or Palestine is with the land of Israel according to them, and nobody's going anywhere. Nobody's going to conquer any more lands. The last thing they want is more Arabs under their control. What they do want is control. And to that extent, they do as much as they can, and they're very successful in controlling the Arab countries around them through regimes and so forth. So that does exist, and through intelligence. But in terms of actually conquering more lands and creating some kind of a greater thing, I don't believe that that's a real issue. Now, I actually was already expelled by Labor, even though I'm not a member of Labor. Last year, I actually had a pass to go into the conference in Liverpool, and on the last day, I went in to hear Corbyn speak, and they revoked my pass from pressure by the Daily Mail and the Zionists. And this year, they wouldn't even approve my pass. It was applied by Labor friends, and they didn't even approve my pass. because I am, as you can hear, a Holocaust denier and anti-Semite. Now, I think the worst thing that you can do when you're being bullied is to back off. When you're being bullied, if you back off, if you cower, if you bend over, if you say, sorry, please don't hurt me, then you've already lost. And that's exactly what Labour has been doing. They've been apologizing and saying, sorry, I'm sorry, don't hurt me. And none of the accusations were true. So whoever's advising Corbyn, whoever is putting together the strategy, I think is making an enormous mistake. An enormous mistake. And we see the results. More and more good people, Chris Williamson and others, are being suspended from the Labour Party, which is absolutely absurd on anti-Semitism. And the accusations don't stop. I mean, if you follow the Board of Deputies, their Twitter, I follow them on Twitter, it's insane the things that are being said, and and some of the mainstream media and so forth. So my advice, if you're being bullied, you stand up, because the bullying will never stop. You cannot appease a bully. We talk about the Holocaust. One of the worst things that happens to any nation that's occupied, and this was true, very much true during the Nazi occupation of Europe in regard to the Jews. The Jews were very compliant, because the idea was, if we're compliant, if we show that we're good law-abiding citizens, then things will be okay. And then the laws get worse and worse and worse, all the way to the point that when people were told to take off their clothes and march into the gas chambers, they complied. There's nothing you can do that is more dangerous, particularly if you are in this kind of a reality, is than to comply. Complying to a bully never works. And what Jeremy Corbyn has been facing from the Zionists, all the way to Benjamin Netanyahu, by the way, who said that he supports terrorism. For a prime minister of another country to interfere like this in the politics of another country, especially when these countries are supposed to be on friendly terms, is absolutely outrageous. To cower down and to apologize is absolutely the kind of compliance you don't want to. And what they should have done, they should have stood up and said, this is absolute nonsense. The accusations of anti-Semitism against people like Chris Williamson or Jackie Walker or some of these others, many of whom are Jewish themselves, is absolutely outrageous. We will not stand for it. Move on. And they would have moved on. They would have come back with something else, but they would have moved on. And whoever created the strategy that said, we need to apologize all day, and by the way, Chris Williamson got in trouble for saying exactly that, that was absolutely the wrong thing to do. And I think we see the results of that right now. So I think that's it, right? My voice is just about, gone. So thank you all very, very much.
Thank you so much, Miko. I think you've absolutely brought the house down and given us so much to think about. And I just want to say thank you to all of you being such a very respectful audience. And thank you for coming along, showing your interest and engagement. If you are interested in finding out a little bit more about our Palestine Solidarity Campaign, we have some information. If you want to become a member, it's very cheap. It's £10 for waged people, just £5 if you're unwaged. And we've got an action outside Sports Direct on the 26th of October to encourage them to boycott Puma for supporting the Israeli Football Association and playing football on stolen land. So if you're interested in coming along, that's at midday outside Sports Direct in Hastings. But in the meantime, thank you again, Miko. You've been fantastic.
Thank you.
There's going to be teas and coffees, so stick around.
And there's BDS buttons if you want them.
Oh, can I have one? I'd love one.
Yeah.